Okay, the topic of this presentation is a bit of a stretch, but I think it has merit. I'm going to make a comparison between two search efforts, one for a missing hiker, the other for a missing plane. Yes, there are significant differences. One involves searching in a relatively small area on land, the other involves searching in a vast area underwater. The circumstances of how each went missing are different, but there are several elements that are common to both. Both are the subject of some of the most intense searches in history. Both involve conflicting eyewitness testimony. Both include a ping ring that can be used to narrow the search area. In both cases, the main question is where to search along the final ring or arc. In both cases, certain assumptions have been made to help constrain the answer. In both cases, Bayesian methods have been applied in an attempt to provide a more systematic approach. In both cases, certain crackpot theories have been proposed that involve abductions by nefarious outsiders. The main difference is that the search for the hiker has now been solved, making it possible to go back and determine how valid the assumptions and methodology were, and possibly apply those lessons to the search for the missing plane. The missing hiker was a person by the name of Bill Ewasko, and he disappeared while on a hike in Joshua Tree National Park on June 24, 2010. First, a word about Joshua Tree. It is a national park in Southern California, about 2 hours east of Los Angeles and north of Palm Springs. It is about the size of Rhode Island. It has a desert climate, meaning that the landscape is fairly open with mainly brushy growth rather than forests. The terrain is quite varied with a mix of low mountains and open areas with numerous washes along with varied rock outcroppings that are popular with rock climbers. In 2010, the park was still fairly new and much of its trail network was poorly marked and mapped. At the time that Bill was visiting, the daily high temperatures were in the upper 80s to low 90s with relative humidity less than 10%. Bill was age 66 at the time and lived in Georgia. He had enjoyed previous visits to Joshua Tree and had decided to fly out to LA for a week of hiking, staying at a condo near Palm Springs owned by a friend. He was in contact with both the condo owner and his girlfriend Mary on the morning of Thursday, June 24th. While he had written down an itinerary of places that he intended to visit, he didn't provide either of his friends with specifics about where he was headed that particular day, other than that he was headed to Joshua Tree. When he failed to check in with Mary at the end of the day, as he had promised, she became worried, and the next morning she contacted the park headquarters to report him missing. Due to the lack of specific information as to where he had gone, it would take until late Saturday for the park authorities to finally locate his car, which they found parked at the Juniper Flats trailhead. That is marked in the lower right corner on this map. This was a common starting point for hikers headed to Quail Mountain, the highest point in the park, and one of the locations on his itinerary. Additional locations on his itinerary that were accessible from this starting point included Smithwater Canyon, Johnny Lang Canyon, and Covington Flats. These four features are part of a mountain barrier that separates Lost Horse Valley to the south from Quail Wash to the north. For scale, the map is about 9 miles square. The search began in earnest on Sunday morning, 3 days after he had disappeared. Based on his likely itinerary, a containment zone was created defined by Smithwater Canyon on the northwest, Quail Wash and the main park road on the north and northeast, Johnny Lang Canyon on the east, and the California Riding and Hiking Trail on the south. Experienced search and rescue personnel were called in to comb the containment zone and surrounding areas where Ewasko might have gone. Late the next day, Monday, a new clue came in. His cell phone had pinged a tower north of the park, the so-called Siren Tower, early Sunday morning, and that ping included a measure of the distance from the tower to the cell phone. It was given as 10.6 miles, good to 10%. Just as with the ping rings for MH370, this information defined a circle on the ground centered on the cell phone tower with a radius of 10.6 miles, but with no information as to where along the circle the phone was located. The ping ring barely touched the containment zone along the western half of Smithwater Canyon, but was otherwise well to the north and west. The search team was not given any information as to how this information had been obtained, and given that it was largely inconsistent with the containment zone that they had already mapped out, they largely ignored it. After 11 days, the containment zone and some of the surrounding areas have been thoroughly searched without success, and the search effort was eventually terminated. The whereabouts of Bill Ewasko remained unknown. Now, there's one additional piece of information that we can note. Bill's car was 20 miles from the Siren Tower, so if Bill were to have reached the ping ring at its nearest point, he would have needed to travel in a northwest direction by about 10 miles, which is consistent with the search area deduced from his itinerary. The light blue markers denote some practical limits to where he could be along the ping. The rightmost marker is at the main park road. Presumably he would have stopped at that point. The leftmost marker is at the start of an area of extremely rough and uninviting terrain that it seems doubtful he would penetrate. While the official search had ended, certain individuals would not give up and decided to continue it on an informal basis. The leader of this effort was a person named Tom Mahood, who had taken part in the initial search and who felt that given the open terrain and limited area that Bill could have reached, it ought to be possible to find him. While it started out as a one-man effort, it eventually grew to over 80 searches undertaken by himself and several others over the next 8 years, documented with GPS tracks. Several assumptions guided these searches. 1. Most assumed that the Siren Tower distance was correct, although there are reasons to doubt its accuracy. 2. It was known that Ewasko had purchased a 24-pack of bottled water the previous day, and all but 2 of those bottles were accounted for in either the condo or in the trunk of his car, meaning that he likely had just 2 bottles of water with him. Mahood theorized that Ewasko had climbed Quail Mountain and then decided to descend down the north side of the mountain with no trail to search for water in Smithwater Canyon, but injured himself on the way down. 3. Bill was known to not use hiking poles, so if he had been injured, he would have had difficulty moving about. 4. Once one exits Smithwater Canyon, one is in Quail Wash, which borders the entire north side of the Quail Mountain complex. Once there, it is an easy walk either downhill north to civilization or uphill east to the main park road. If Bill had reached this far, he likely would have exited the area to safety. 5. The ping ring itself crossed Quail Wash from Smithwater Canyon to rugged mountains to the north. Given the ease with which one can exit via Quail Wash itself, it was unlikely that Bill would have continued on to those mountains. 6. Further, entering those mountains would have meant ascending into rugged terrain. Again, that seemed unlikely. 7. Even if he had entered those mountains, there was a trail through them, the West Samuelson Cutoff, that was easy to navigate. 8. If he had made it close to Park Road, he would have been found by now due to the large number of people that traversed the area. This map shows the ensemble of all searches documented with GPS tracks. The combined distance is over 1,000 miles and probably closer to 2,000. The slopes on the south side of Smithwater Canyon in particular have been combed extensively. It is one of the few areas that has cell phone reception and falls on the ping ring. Up to this point, the areas searched were chosen more or less by guesswork by the individual searchers. At this point, a group of researchers decided to make a more systematic study. Using a technique known as Bayesian analysis, they decided to combine 2 pieces of information. Cell phone coverage is spotty inside the park. One piece of information is a splash map showing the likelihood of cell phone reception at every location in and around the search area. The second was a map with the GPS tracks shown on the previous slide. The degree to which human remains could be spotted varied quite a bit depending on the location, being much greater in open terrain with little vegetation, but much less in rocky terrain with dense ground cover. In spite of that, it was assumed that 50 feet on either side of a search path could be scanned reliably. In any case, the result was a map that you see here. Now, the choice of base map was unfortunate. The light green and pale yellow colors are irrelevant, and only the reddish, orangish, and dark yellows denote high probability areas to search. You can see that there are 2 main areas of interest, both on the northeast side of Quail Wash, which is where it was thought unlikely that Ewasko would have gone. I will leave the story of Bill Ewasko for now. The missing aircraft, of course, is MH370. While its story is far better known than that of Bill Ewasko, I will still give a brief summary. Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 was a scheduled red-eye flight from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia to Beijing, China. On March 8, 2014, which is March 7th Universal Time, 40 minutes after takeoff, the plane disappeared from air traffic control radar. Although it was first thought to have crashed in the South China Sea between Malaysia and Vietnam, subsequent analysis of military radar and satellite data showed that the plane had actually reversed course, flown back across the Malaysian peninsula, turned northwest along the Strait of Malacca, then turned south, flying for over 7 hours before eventually crashing into the southern Indian Ocean. While any number of theories have been put forward to explain what happened on board, the most common view is that it was the result of deliberate action by someone on board the plane. Just as was the case with Bill Ewasko, the radio communications between the plane's satellite communication system and the 3-F1 satellite in geostationary orbit produced timing information that defined a circle on the surface of the Earth. In this case, 7 circles centered on the sub-satellite point were generated, and the final ping ring had a radius of order 2,600 nautical miles. Again, as with Ewasko, the main challenge was and still is to define where along the final ping ring to search. In the case of MH370, there was a complication in that the plane started inside the final ping ring, and even though there were ping rings at intermediate times, the plane had enough fuel that it could have traveled well to the north or to the south and still cross the intermediate rings at the proper time, and thus the timing and data alone couldn't distinguish the two. The degeneracy was broken by making use of frequency information. Now, an explanation of how this works is far too technical for a detailed explanation here. Suffice it to say that the frequency of the transmission from the aircraft SATCOM system as measured by a ground station would differ between a northern and southern flight path. In this diagram, universal time is on the horizontal axis, frequency is on the vertical axis. The frequency that would be measured if the plane went north is shown as the red line. If the plane went south, it's shown as the green line, and what was actually measured is shown as the blue line. It is clear that the blue line matches the southern path. The equivalent of a hiker's itinerary for an aircraft is a flight plan, and for MH370, no such plan existed once the plane diverted from its original course. Thus, investigators, in this case the Defence Science and Technology Group of Australia, needed to utilize other data to determine where to search for the aircraft, and these consisted of the radar plus satellite data, which were used to determine possible flight paths that the plane might have taken, all ending at the 7th arc. As with the Ewasko, certain assumptions needed to be made, and these were that the aircraft had been piloted in a manner that is typical of how commercial pilots normally fly. A Monte Carlo simulation was done that allowed the plane to change speed, altitude, and direction according to a statistical model, and by applying a Bayesian analysis, the measurements of the burst timing offset and the burst frequency offset at each of the 7 arcs were used to determine which combination of speed, altitude, and bearing worked best. The result was a heat map giving a probability distribution of where the plane was likely to have come down on the 7th arc. Once it became clear that the plane had crashed in the southern Indian Ocean, Australia and the Australian Transport Safety Bureau took charge and conducted a 2-year search from 2014 through 2016, scanning the seafloor for debris in the area defined by the heat map as previously described. Unlike Ewasko, the primary means used to search for MH370 was not a person walking on the surface of the Earth equipped with a Mark I human eyeball, but rather a device called either a towfish pulled by the ship or an autonomous underwater vehicle, either one being equipped with a side-scan sonar, which makes modest resolution images of the seafloor. As with the case with the Ewasko, a concerted search effort was undertaken to locate the aircraft. The area scan was 38 times the size of Joshua Tree National Park. Ultimately, however, nothing was found, and the search was terminated, although in this case it was due to funding limitations and a portion of the search area remained uncovered. Just as with the Ewasko, a volunteer stepped up to continue the search. In this case, it was a private company called Ocean Infinity. Now, Ocean Infinity is relatively new, funded by venture capital, aiming to capitalize on new technology to provide efficient ways to map the seafloor over large areas. Okay, its real origin was with wealthy shipwreck hunters. A search for MH370 provided it with a high-profile way to demonstrate its capabilities. It started by finishing off the uncovered areas of the ATSB search, then continuing up north along the 7th arc with a restricted range and width. The area covered was an additional 35 Joshua Tree National Parks. As with the Ewasko, even this volunteer effort failed to find the plane. At this point, conspiracy theorists stepped in to provide alternate explanations as to why the searches had failed. In the case of Ewasko, one person named Adam Marsland noted various oddities. For example, why no cell phone pings were heard before Sunday? Why did he carry so little water? Why would he have headed so far north? In the case of MH370, one person, Jeff Wise, has also noted various oddities. Why did the satellite communication system reboot just after the plane left military radar coverage? Why only young barnacles were found on pieces of debris that were found from the aircraft, like the flaperon? Both question why searches had failed. In the case of Ewasko, it was conjectured that Bill had been abducted by a certain Mr. X, that his car had been moved around by being transported in a U-Haul trailer. This is to reconcile conflicting eyewitness accounts about seeing or not seeing his car before it had been definitively located, and that the cell phone ping had been made intentionally from a deceptive location in order to plant misleading evidence. In the case of MH370, it has been conjectured that the plane was abducted by Russians and actually flew north, matching the ping ring timings, but that someone on board the plane deliberately hacked the SATCOM such that the burst frequency offsets were altered to make the plane appear to go south, thus planting misleading evidence. The only difference between the two cases is that Marsland also allowed that there might be a more conventional explanation as well for why Bill has not been found, while Wise has not done the same thing for MH370. Yet the question still remains, why had Bill not been found? Was it because he was not there? Not at all. He was there all right. In February 2022, a group of people from Tennessee traveled to Joshua Tree National Park for a camping trip. In the late afternoon on February 8th, after having set up camp, they moved off trail to find a spot from where they could get a good view of sunset. When they found a good spot, they noticed bones scattered on the ground. Investigating further, they found more bones and an old day pack. A wallet had fallen out of a torn pocket. It was filled with ID and credit cards. The name on the cards was Bill Ewasko. Bill had finally been found. Where was he found? Here's the map from the original search. He was just north of the original containment zone, close to 3 different trails in the mountains northeast of Quail Wash, where it was thought unlikely he would go. Less than a mile from the main park road, where it was thought that he would have been found already. The location was on a ridge or shoulder that runs off the side of a mountain, uphill in rugged terrain, where it was again thought unlikely he would go. Most of the bones in the day pack were contained in a small ring of stones. One would have to have been practically on top to spot them. How did Bill end up where he was? It seems almost certain that he had found his way out of Quail Wash to the Samuelson West Cutoff Trail, which takes one from Quail Wash across a divide to a set of trails that eventually lead to the main park road. The Samuelson West Cutoff starts out in a wash itself, but partway up it cuts to the right, up the side of the wash, out over a divide between 2 mountains, and then down towards the trails to Park Boulevard. In 2010, the path to exit the wash was not signed and was likely not at all obvious, so Ewasko continued on in the wash until it led him to a steep hillside with nothing in front but mountain. At this point he turned right to leave the wash, but that led him up a steep slope that dumped him onto the ridge where he finally could go no further. How close did the volunteers come to finding him? There were actually 2 search paths that came quite close. For the first one, by Tom Mahood in 2012, he was exploring the area at the base of a ridge as part of a program to fill in gaps in coverage of the ping ring, but he would later explain that he saw no reason to ascend to the ridge itself. The second one, by a certain Perry and SH44, actually crossed the ridge at the approximate spot where I took the photo shown previously. I estimate they were about 150 or so feet away from the ring. By their account, they were returning to their car and were in a hurry, so they didn't take time to survey the ridge properly. If we go back to the list of assumptions that had been made about where Bill would be found, we find that only the first one, that the ping ring was valid, was correct. All others turned out to be wrong. After everyone confidently knew that he did not use hiking poles, what was found by the recovery team? Hiking poles. After everyone assumed he had only carried 2 bottles of water, what was also found by the recovery team? A container that might have held up to 3 liters of water. The location where he is found does not have cell phone reception, so after his phone pinged the tower, he must have traveled an additional unknown distance. It is still unclear how Ewasko ended up at the Samuelson West Cutoff in the first place. There are competing theories since we don't know the actual route from his car to this area. It would have been necessary to cross from the south side of Quail Mountain to the north, which can be done by any of a number of routes all involving cross-country travel, or else by descending Smithwater Canyon, which seems the most likely. Once in Quail Wash, why did he try to exit via the rugged route through the mountains instead of the easier north or east exits? Here I think we need to remind ourselves that these questions are being asked by people who are familiar with the geography of this portion of the park, whereas one needs to think like an out-of-stater for whom all this is new. From just about any vantage point in this area of the park, what one sees is a vast expanse of empty flat areas surrounded by low mountains, continuing off to the horizon, and the sense is of one of immense isolation. Unless you can see cars, the park road is invisible. If you try to match up the view to a map, it can be challenging because there are no prominent landmarks. The flat areas are often laced with the remnants of old roads that were often removed from maps, which could lead to confusion for even an experienced hiker encountering them. The actual trails that the Park Service wanted to encourage use of were often poorly signed and could be difficult to follow. What are the lessons for finding MH370? Just because you don't find someone or something the first time doesn't mean that they aren't there. In the case of MH370, only 80% of the original probability distribution has been searched. The plane might be in the remaining 20%. Even the area that has been scanned has gaps in the coverage. It could have been missed by the side-scan sonar due to some feature that made the debris field less visible. One need not and should not appeal to exotic theories in a knee-jerk reaction. Just like Bill, it is there, somewhere.